Hello everyone, and welcome to Mr. Simplify's tutorials. In this tutorial we're going to look at abnormal psychology. Now, to understand what abnormal psychology is, it is important to understand what abnormal behavior is. Now, time and again we come across the term abnormal behavior, be it through the digital media, print media, stories we tell one another, etc. We are always exposed to people telling each other that so-and-so person behaves in an abnormal way, etc., etc. But what would you say is actually abnormal in terms of behaviors, and what would be termed as normal? Now, socially, abnormal behavior can be gauged through various lenses, which may or may not be appropriate. Now, for example, a person not adhering to certain social norms set by the society or a group of people can actually be considered to be abnormal by the majority. Let me give you an example. Now, if you imagine a person walking around the street wearing a chicken costume, you'd think of that person as abnormal. But if the same person is wearing that same chicken costume in a child's birthday party or in a football match, then that person might probably not be considered to be abnormal. Now, if you just gauge what I meant by abnormal personality through the lens of the society, it's complicated. It's not as straightforward as just gauging a person to be normal or abnormal. So essentially, a change of perspective will change what normal and abnormal are. It is therefore not sufficient to look at abnormal behavior through just one lens. Okay? So abnormal behavior is therefore considered to be a combination of personal distress, psychological dysfunction, deviance from social norms, and hostility towards oneself and others. So it is a combination of all of these various lenses that constitutes abnormal behavior. Okay? Now this leads us to defining abnormal psychology. Abnormal psychology is the scientific study of abnormal behavior. The intent of studying abnormal psychology is to be able to predict, explain, diagnose, and identify the causes of and also treat abnormal behavior. Now, an interesting perspective on abnormal behavior was suggested by Rosenhan and Seligman. Now, by their definition, a person is considered to be abnormal if they're unable to cope with the demands of everyday life. So, everyday situations, there would be people who are unable to cope with them, okay? Now, they came up with certain characteristics of people who fail to function or cope with everyday life. Now let's look at these characteristics. So the first characteristic is suffering. Now, an abnormal person, in their opinion, would be suffering in some way. Okay? Now, the second characteristic is maladaptive behavior. This means an abnormal person would face difficulty when it comes to adapting to change or to obstacles. Okay? For instance, we've recently all adapted to learn and work from home, right? Now, it would be normal to experience some level of withdrawal. Now, I can experience withdrawal, you can experience withdrawal. So some element of withdrawal is normal, but maladaptive behavior would be if you fail completely to adapt to this change, and to the extent that you experience immense anger or actually resort to self-harm. So that is the level that we are actually talking about when we talk about maladaptive behavior. The next characteristic is unconventionality. So an abnormal person's behavior is expected to be unconventional or odd in many completely normal situations. The next characteristic is unpredictability and loss of control. Now, most people's behavior is quite predictable in most situations. Abnormal people could behave in a rather unpredictable manner to the extent of this behavior becoming completely and inappropriate to most people. Yeah? Irrational and incomprehensibility. This is the next characteristic. And what this means is that people would actually fail to understand some behaviors of abnormal people. Yeah? Now, an example would be people who are irrationally afraid of numbers or mathematics beyond the levels of imagination of most people. Now, there can be some disorders, there can be some phobias, but we're not talking about aversion to that level. Now, this is just inexplainable or incomprehensible behavior. Okay? The next characteristic is observer discomfort. Now, abnormal people can cause discomfort or can actually trigger, as you'd say in this day and age, other people around them. So this is what this characteristic refers to. The next characteristic is violation of moral and ideal standards. Now, abnormal people's behavior deviates from the moral or the ideal standards of the society. Now, this could refer to anything from urinating in public, for example, to even downloading illegal content of the web. So this essentially means a violation of the social structure that's laid out. Okay. Now, the next interesting concept in terms of abnormal behavior and abnormal psychology that we're going to look at is called the GAF scale. Now, clinically, it's important to understand that if a person is abnormal, to what level clinically is that extent of abnormality, because what we're looking to achieve from studying abnormal behavior is to actually diagnose abnormal behavior and then to treat it. This is because essentially we're all normal in some way and abnormal in some others, right? And the important consideration here is the level of clinical abnormality in individuals. So after several revisions to Rosenhan Seligman's characteristics, the American Psychiatric Association came up with the GAF scale, which is also called the Global Assessment of Functioning Scale. So this essentially is a scale which helps mental health providers understand the extent to which a person can cope with normal life, or to the extent to which a person can essentially function normally. Now, an individual's rating could actually be based on one or more activities like interviews, questionnaires, medical histories, police records, etc. And then people are actually rated and assessed based on their rating. Okay, now let's look at the GAF scale. So this scale is actually derived from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 4th edition. Okay, now the higher a patient is on this scale, the better he or she is in terms of mental health. So people scoring 0 to 10 could be severe threats to themselves and to society, and as we go higher on the scale, the symptoms get milder and manageable, as you can see there. And the levels at the top tend towards mild to almost no symptoms. Now, it's very interesting. As you rise higher, you can clearly see that the level and the severity of the symptoms start getting milder. The level gets lower and the symptoms start getting milder. Now, this scale has mostly now been replaced by a newer scale designed by the WHO, but some doctors still, to this day and age, tend to use the GAF scale to rate the severity of an individual's abnormality. Okay, so quite an interesting concept. Now, speaking of interesting concepts, another interesting perspective on abnormal behavior was provided by Mary Jahoda. Now, Mary proposed that for a person to be considered abnormal, they would need to have deviated from an ideal state, an ideal mental state, and the absence of a mental illness isn't in itself a clear enough indicator of mental well-being. So it's not sufficient for a person to be free of mental illnesses to actually be in an ideal state. Now, achieving ideal mental health consists of meeting the following criteria, in our opinion. So these are the criteria she set for ideal mental health. The first criteria is a positive attitude towards self. Now, individuals, in our opinion, should be happy with themselves to quite a good level, and they should have a positive attitude towards their own life. Self-actualization. Now, this is not to be confused. This is slightly different from Carl Rogers' humanistic approach to self-actualization. This refers more to the feeling of contentment with oneself and the feeling that you're the best version of yourself. Okay? Autonomy. Now, just as the word implies, this directs towards the feeling of independence and to not depend too heavily on other people for survival. So the ideal, a person with an ideal mental health is independent to some extent. Okay, resistance to stress. Now, this directs towards the capacity to handle everyday stressful situations competently. Now, stress will obviously cause anxiety to a certain level to everybody, but the level of anxiety experienced should be manageable, and a person with an ideal mental health level will come out of a stressful situation in one piece, essentially. Environmental mastery. Now, this refers to adapting to a new situation and new environments. For instance, a person with ideal mental health will be equipped to adapt to any sort of a changing circumstance, like a change of a job or a relocation to a new city, etc. And there will not be any level of emotional trauma when it comes to environmental adaptation. Okay? The next element is accurately perceiving reality. Now, this refers to a person's perception to seeing the world around him or her. Now, a person's perception of seeing the world around should be the same or similar to most other people around them in society. So that is this very important factor. Now, okay, so these were some of the criteria that Mary elaborated in terms of reaching that ideal mental health. Now, if we look at a completely different perspective on abnormal behavior, this was provided by R.D. Laing. So Laing, interestingly enough, completely disagreed with the approach of treating abnormalities like biological phenomena. He actually proposed that society ruthlessly subjects people into situations wherein they just cannot conform to any standards. Interesting. And abnormal behavior and mental illness are ways people actually use to free themselves, are actually mechanisms that people use to free themselves from such unbearable circumstances. So basically, it is the result of the unbalance in the system or the society itself. Okay, so he believed that no such thing as a biological phenomenon exists. He didn't actually deny the existence of mental illnesses completely, but actually saw it from a completely different lens than most others. He stated that abnormalities could be like transformative journeys, and then with the right approach, people going through them could return back wiser and actually become better people. They could actually become ideal members of the society, better than you or me. Okay, so these are some really interesting perspectives on abnormal behavior. What is your opinion on this very interesting topic? What are your observations on this? Do you believe that abnormal behavior is a societal problem? Do you think that most people who are actually considered to be or deemed abnormal are actually normal people going through a journey of self-discovery or enlightenment? Let me know your thoughts, please. And as usual, as always, thank you very much for your attendance. And if you like this content, please subscribe to the channel, like this tutorial, and share all of the content here, as there is a lot more content coming on a regular basis now. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.